Hey, how's everybody doing today? It's Ofo Izugu
Hey, it's Kylie Green here.
with the WYL Take Ownership podcast, where we're all about taking ownership of your mental, your economics, and your community. We have a special guest today, Mr.
Yes.
John Jackson himself. Glad to have you here, man. John is the co-founder of Blavity and a Nieman fellow this year at Harvard coming up. Proud of you, brother. Glad to have you
Very
today.
excited.
Appreciate it, man. I'm excited to be here. It's a pleasure.
Absolutely, absolutely. So the cool thing here is that Kelly, Franz, our producer, we're all talking. We're like, John, you can go many different directions with conversation. So, but of course, what it made me think about was all the conversations we'd have off the cuff when you pop into our office random times or vice versa. So what I'd love to speak about first is kind of this concept of like what real success versus fake success looks like.
Yep.
And also how that plays into mental health and our movement forward, I think, in general.
Yeah.
And I know you have a lot to say on that because we've spoken about these kind of things before, but you and I were just included on the same thread on LinkedIn. Maya, she had Maya's last name Pope
Chappelle, yeah.
Pope Chappelle, amazing. She's been super amazing. I know I'm working with her before, but she had this cool thing she had posted about kind of like how do we find balance? Like,
Yeah.
what does our day to day look like? Because we do wear several hats, as we were kind of joking about before we came on air here. For you, how do you tend to find balance in your day to day? Kind of give people a little bit more insight into like what you do right now.
Yeah. So previously to my opportunity to be a Nieman Fellow, I was a co-founder of Blavity. So I ran corporate brand, which is really a hybrid between probably what would be professionally known as like corporate PR, brand awareness, and then I did usually larger deals. And I did a lot of sort of unscalable stuff as it relates to community work and things like that. So I wanted to make sure that I had my hands in everything, that you were touching the audience that we were trying to say we were serving, and positioning ourselves well in the marketplace to be disruptive. I think for me, as it relates to balance, I haven't really had any for like the past 4 to 5 years, if we're keeping it a buck. Like,
Right.
I think there's an integration that has to happen specific to how you think about the life you want to live and what you're integrating into it. So we talk about this pretty extensively, but I don't really see a work life as a balance. I see it as like balls that are rubber and some that are glass. And there are certain glass ones that can't drop. Like, so for me, health can't drop, family can't drop. I think like work means that if the glass balls are slipping, then I have to reallocate more energy to paying attention to making sure that ball isn't like off center. I think a lot of that comes down to rituals, like it's daily habits, daily practice. Again, and we travel a lot, right? And so even when you're on the road, it's like I need to carve out time to like be quiet, to pray, to journal, to read, because those things take me out of like the fever pitch that entrepreneurship has, bro. Like, I feel like every time we've talked, I'm definitely taking you away from like a pitch deck, an investor, a team. Kelly's like, why are you in the office, bro? Like, this is cool. Like, I love it. But like,
He said, I
don't make, yeah, it's like plies. He's like, I don't make no money arguing with you. She's like, this isn't getting me paid, Jonathan. Thanks so much. Bye. So I feel like those grounding activities for me, like community, allows me to just like step back, because we work so hard in our businesses. We work so hard to make, a week in entrepreneurship is like 3 months anywhere else, just because of the volume of things you are receiving. And if you are not pouring into yourself, you become like an empty vessel. And then what's worse than, I think sometimes because you're like, I can deal with it, I can take it. If you're sort of a founder syndrome, it's your team gets a lower fidelity version of you. And then that affects everything. It affects how they perform, because then they start to, they might shrink back. They might not give you the same quality feedback. Like, there's an actual reverberation as it relates to self that touches all the things that we say we care about as we grow. So I try to remember that. And I think me not taking care of myself has a direct and proportional impact on everything I say I care about. And me being healthy holistically also has an exponential impact on everything I touch and the things that I want to have a positive effect on.
Nah, I hear you, man. I hear you. How does family play into it all?
I think for me, like, family has a really like a deep-seated framework. So I'm West Indian, so most of my family like is sort of spread across. So some are in the Caribbean, some are where all the other West Indians are. So it's either like Toronto, New York, like England, or like Trinidad or Atlanta, right? And so for me, like there's just like 5 places you go. And so I think for me, like I always felt like community was something that there was just no escape from. Like growing up, people would recognize you off your face. Like before you knew who they were, you'd walk in and they'd be like, oh, you're so-and-so's son, or you're so-and-so's grandchild. Yep. And so you are dealing with the legacy of who that person is before you even have an understanding of who that person was. And so literally people in the village, if you keep the metaphor solid, know you for what your family was. Whether that's fair or not is a completely separate conversation, but it sort of indoctrinates you, and me at least, into having sort of this very, very rigorous sense of family. Both my parents are the oldest. And so my dad's the oldest of 4, my mom's the oldest of 4 too. And so like they have a deep sense of responsibility that they like imbued us with, I think by nature of them being the oldest siblings. And so there's like, I got to take care of this. I got to make sure this is okay. My parents are going to tell me things first. And so how do I get, and I think I have the tendency to frame my life along those pillars. And I've had to unlearn some of the things that were unhealthy about that framework. But I've had to rely on some of those things that have helped me navigate situations that otherwise would have felt untenable, but I've seen them in a different context. So my framework, I think in that sort of like communal strategy applies to my thinking on economics. It applies to my thinking on sort of like what success would mean. And I think it permeates into the kind of work and the kind of spaces I choose or don't choose to be in if they don't align with that sense of family. Because in Trinidad, right, like and on the holidays, you don't just eat at your house. You open, you know how it goes. You walk outside and people have their doors open. You know what I'm saying? And then on Boxing Day, you bring cake. Like like the neighborhood comes outside.
Absolutely.
And so, you know, that's the kind of environment that I enjoy being in. And so I have to think about how do I nurture that environment in the spaces I am, even if people aren't used to that. Right. And I think there's a trust factor that has to go into there. But, you know, you can extrapolate that all the way to audience building. When you think about how do you gain somebody's trust in a world where it's really loud and really noisy, you end up doing unscalable stuff so you can build equity with them. Because you can't take like their attention for granted. And I think you got to really think about like, how can this narrative command something of value to them and for them?
No, most definitely.
It's really good.
I call in planning stuff. I was called you and Alex Wolf are more like heady guests, right? Because I feel like your guys' minds are always thinking about, especially that last part, right? Like from an engagement standpoint, from a standpoint of just keeping connected to people, like giving real value.
Right.
Yeah. So I've always found that to be very interesting. So I have a question here, and it kind of touches on something that's really recent, but also just kind of it's overarching. So I talked about the idea of fake success versus real success, and we're in a world now where we don't really sometimes know the difference. You know,
Thanks, social media.
Yeah, right. Like that's literally what's on top of my mind as I'm thinking about that. But then this question, I guess, has layers to it because this is real because it's been achieved, but it's also based off of something that wasn't real, right?
Yep.
So what I'm talking about is like the Forbes cover comes out,
Right.
right? Kylie Jenner is sported on the cover. 20 years old, almost a billionaire, 900 million, amassed that mostly in the last 3 years. She got more money than Jay. Like,
Right.
what? So what's wild is that, you know, lip kits was kind of her first thing, right? First like cosmetic product, premised off the fact that she was getting like collagen in her lips.
Yeah, lip fillers.
Yeah. And, you know, there's multiple layers, right? You have the fact that she was called self-made, which people, of course, take exception to because her family is extremely wealthy from all facets of it. She did work hard, so there's that component of it as well. So people had support. There's also the component of it that, like, for a lot of black women, they're like, yo, we naturally have these features. We've always had these features. And once again, it's proven that when a white person sports these features that we are born with, it gets love. I've been reading this John Michel Basquiat book, Widow of John Michel. And there's a part where they talk about the graffiti scene and how he, although he was mired in it and was really good under the name Samo, he could have never really popped just doing that. And also he wasn't able to bring it to like the Soho vibe of it really being acknowledged until like I forgot the guy's name, but it was a white guy that ended up doing it. And
Mm-hmm.
they were friends, but there was always this weird contentious nature of their friendship because John was like, yo, I was a better graffiti artist than him, but because he's a white dude, it was now mainstream. So
Yep.
the question, I guess, on all that is kind of like, Kelly alluded to it. Where do you draw the line? What is when fate can turn into real, actualized success?
Mm-hmm.
What is that? What is that balance? What are your thoughts on that concept in general?
So I was looking at that feed yesterday. I think Everett Taylor, shout out to Everett, man, and all the things he's done and does for people. That a lot of that goes unnoticed, but I feel like he had a really poignant point there. He was like, we can sit here and talk about how this is. We could debate the merits of this, and there's room for that. But I hope we do two things. One, we support stuff like Mented Cosmetics. Mm-hmm. If we know that we don't like how this looks, we have alternative options for us. Mm-hmm. The second thing, and I thought the more relevant thing, was this reality that there's a really meaningful conversation around how she did it, mm-hmm. what systems of access she had, and what that actually means. And how are those things routinely sort of made to function to provide vehicles of wealth? Because that's the family she's dealing with. Like, the reality is she's set up to make $900 million.
Right, absolutely.
Course, yeah.
And so I'm interested. I try to think across systems.
Right.
So there's the emotional response of being like, Forbes accomplished its job.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Engagement
Right.
was off the charts. Whether you didn't like it, were bothered by it, felt like it was trash, were intrigued by it, you read it.
And that's what I was. Yeah,
And now we're talking
absolutely.
about it.
And by read, I mean you clicked, which means you were factored into an engagement rate, which means they probably had one of their best visit days of the year, bar none. Mm-hmm. And they knew they would by putting a 20-year-old on the
maybe
company.
ever because of how big she is. Right?
And her she
110
millions.
million people follow her, Instagram alone.
That's right. So I find that the reality of success is around like how the rooms sometimes we're in aren't designed for us to be successful in. If you think about the models that you have personally, and then the things you may or may not compromise to get something you don't want, it then alludes to this idea of why I think a lot of us get seen as arrogant when we do things. Mm-hmm. And I think a part of that is because I don't need to show you I'm excited to prove that I'm grateful. I also don't need to prove that I'm excited to be in a room that is not structured for me to be alive in. So I fought to get here, had to claw through the door, and then I'm at the table now, and you want me to perform more, so you feel like I'm more grateful because that makes you feel more comfortable about me. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And to me, that is a deeply insidious thing that sometimes we are okay with. And the only table I really care about being on is a cap table. So I'm not really excited to be in this room. I'm only interested in the skill acquisition. I'm interested in learning how power functions. And I'm interested in taking as much of it as possible and reallocating it where I believe it should go.
Absolutely.
And I think to me that is what has allowed me to move sort of fluidly through spaces that otherwise would have been fairly boxed. And so I bridge my success by thinking about like, what is the highest value activity I could be doing right here for what I know isn't accessible to everyone? Because we spend a lot of time in rooms, not just being like the only like black person. Sometimes we're the only person with a framework of life that applies here. So you're dealing with like the weight of like, oh man, it's just me in here. And then you're getting literal information that would have changed your life 2 years ago. You're literally like, oh my God, if I had known this 6 months ago, my entire decision framework, especially if you're building a business, like that's a tweak that could have actually gotten you users or all those things. And so you have to like process that in real time, take it back, and then you have to sit with it and be like, okay, by what means should I deliver this information? And that to me has a bigger conversation around ecosystems, right? So it's like, what vehicles do we use to communicate information to people that otherwise wouldn't have it? Are we being thoughtful about how we're delivering it? Right? When Malcolm X said by any means, like for me, that was a comprehensive statement. Like I believe that's like education by any means. I think that's like wealth generation by means that is actually cyclical, which means it can stay. And so I take that and I think about like, okay, by what means are we communicating clearly to the communities we say we care about? Because shaming them for not knowing something that we just learned is just as bad, in my mind, as holding that information away. Because you've accomplished nothing by making people feel worse about their condition than the conditions already place on them. And so there's no freedom quotient anywhere in that.
That's real. That's
Wow,
real.
that is real. And I'm wondering, like, in terms of like the Black community, how do you feel we can get better at like employing those ideas to everyone else, so that it's not knowledge that we're just harboring ourselves?
Yeah, I think I really wrestle with this, right? Because I think everybody's working, everybody's growing, and a lot of it's about time allocation and like knowing yourself, like literally freeing yourself from whatever negative scripts you have, whatever. Like, to me, that is the most critical component of this. And I used to think that was like really, really like sort of woo-woo and like super meta until I started evaluating the things I literally thought about myself and where I learned them from. And I learned a lot of negative things from people who really care about me. And it wasn't because they were malice. It was because they did everything they could to survive to get to a point. That is not necessarily what success would look like for me, but because that's the upper band of their knowledge, they tried to give me as much of it as possible. And so a more mature me has understood that they did everything they could do. I think the question becomes, at some point you have to be cool diverting from whatever the norm is. Like, entrepreneurs, I think, get this sort of naturally, being like, yo, I'm just out here being crazy, blah, 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 blah. But I think when you remove like the hyperbole of that, the entrepreneurial not thinking, right? Whether you build a VC-backed business or whatever the thing is you have, that is something that I believe can be transmuted into different spaces. I think a lot of us operate in silos sometimes, which is why community is super important, right? That's why I was really thankful that in New York I had Alley was less important than who was in it. Because there were days where I was just like, I need to see a Black person. And I could go upstairs and like Ofo was there, or Keenan was there, or Lindsay was there, or Nisha was there, or Micah was there, or Devon is there. Right? Like, those are things that really, really mattered to me, given the rooms I have to be in and the things I have to navigate. I don't know if we always talk to each other with the level of deference we should. Because sometimes I think we talk to each other from the insecurity we have that we haven't solved for. So you don't share the things you don't believe you're going to get back. You literally keep the things you don't think you're ever going to get more of. So that becomes a mindset situation. So you're like, nah, I got to give. And like, that's cool. But even if you were solving for that, that's assuming you have all the information. That's literally assuming that like, this is the best option. The only way I can get it is by actioning it. And that assumes that you couldn't action it and share it. And I just don't think that's true functionally. And outside of it being an NDA conversation, it really comes down to a personal preference of how you show up in community. And if you know your role, which I think you learn through time and understanding, right? Like, I've told people multiple times, I've turned down speaking engagements. People like, Jonathan, you're like a digital activist. And I'm like, no, I'm not. That is not you don't get to call yourself an activist for going to a march, just like you don't get to call yourself a model for having a photo shoot. Like, those are, you don't get to just like, you don't get to do the label and then do the thing, right? And I think a lot of us, because we are multifaceted, it can be difficult to sort of understand where you are unless you know who you are. So then if you know who you are, it's easy to be like, this is the work that I do. This may in fact fall under these frameworks or these framings that sort of are publicly and widely accessible. Okay, cool. But knowing who I am helps me understand who I'm not, which then makes me more effective, because I can be like, actually, I shouldn't be on this panel or keynoting, but here are 6 people who do this work, that just go talk to them. Like, and I'll intro you, whatever. That's 10 minutes out of my day that saves me the embarrassment of not wanting to be somewhere, give somebody else a chance to be exactly where they need to be and get recognized for their genius. And if it goes well, as a byproduct, I look like a hero. because I just solved two people's problems. In the time it would have taken me to like pretend like I needed to be Superman, I was like, nope, like not a hero. I think so that's one of the ways I've found it easier, and that builds trust, because I'm not trying to take anything, and I just know what's for me is for me, so I don't need to have what you have. I just want to focus on like receiving what I literally am going to get.
Right. Yeah, oftentimes I think one thing I've noticed about, and I'm looking at more at our own community. So as Black people, a lot of times I find that successful women have become successful because they've learned early on that they're in it together. So they're constantly, whether it's even spaces to just emote, whether it's spaces to the supportive spaces of trading contacts, all that kind of stuff, they're actively doing it.
Yep.
We see it all the time. I mentioned today earlier on a panel, Issa Rae and what she's done with Insecure, and the fact that from the clothing she's wearing to the music they're playing and the way that's scored to the actors and actresses that she gives shots on her show, like she completely believes in, and she even said it, but she completely believes in work with who's around you and extract those skills from them and work with them and put their value into the world, but also to give people opportunity, right? So like that give to get thing. What I've seen though on the flip side, so I'm talking about black brothers, like us as brothers, is that while there's some of us that do that, what I wonder is what pages can we take from what women are doing to make us even stronger, right? And I think naturally, just as men, we tend to the old adage, the old joke was like, you're looking for directions and the dude doesn't pull over, right? He's like, he's gonna figure it out, right? And even when he doesn't know where he's going, and the wife's like, hey, we got Google Maps, there's a stranger on the corner we could ask, but I got it, honey, right? So there's this level, and it comes from, I guess, this idea of protecting and all that stuff that's layered in the ego, all that stuff. As we've seen so many successful Black women succeed and ascend over the last, 5 to 10 years, right? We see in media, we see in the business world, African American women are the most active group of entrepreneurs in America. Do you feel like we've done our job in being supportive of them? And do you feel like and also too, like, what can we do to do more ourselves as well?
Yeah, no, I don't think we've done our job at all, and I think that's more of an indictment of like how we are socialized and what we think our job is, versus what it could be, versus what we could be. I think you touched on a few things, but the one that like sticks out the most again is like we battle ourselves and then we go out and like battle each other, and a lot of it is like really about like what you're not willing to deal with in yourself. And then how another person in proximity to you is always a mirror. So they literally, by being there, will elucidate the things that you might not want to deal with. And it's not going away, because the closer they get, the more you see the things you don't like. And so if you've never spent time with yourself, spending time with another person won't help. It just creates codependency. And I think that's sometimes too often, I think, like relegated to the terms of like a romantic relationship. But I think in like friendships and in how we exist as peers, a lot of us aren't happy for each other. Like, to be frank, like a lot of us aren't excited about other people winning. And I really think there are a lot of dudes I've met, and I started to be able to sense like you're uncomfortable right now. And I'm trying to understand, like, I don't want to take anything from you. And I get it, but a lot of us have sort of left unchecked emotional baggage from being hurt that we never dealt with. Somebody did us dirty like 10 years ago, and it was traumatic, and we never talked about it, and we never cried, and no one ever, we never got the thing we needed. So we end up trying to treat women like rehab centers, and that's literally not their job, right? And so when they're like, nah, like, I'm good, love, enjoy, like, you got to sit and think about like, how are you going to deal with you, separate of all the other things in your life? Because I read a study recently around like friendships, and there was a study they did where like men die earlier after their woman's spouse dies, and that is directly correlated because they don't have deeper friendships. Women outlive, so that their husband will die, but then they go on and live their life because, generally speaking, they have some sort of village, or they have actual human interaction or connection that allows them to grieve and process. And literally people die from a broken heart. Like at that age,
Right.
you literally are like, right. And I think for like us, there's a lot of conversations we got to have. But to me, the one that I have had to have with myself, and the one I think I talk about because it's most personal, is just like, how do you view yourself absent of all the things people know you for? Like, do you believe you're enough if today was the last most successful day you had? Like, are you good with you? Not are you good with that, but are you good with who you are, right? Baseline. And can you sit with your own baseline and do the self work and the inner work and, like, you know, go to therapy and, you know, potentially get on some medication? Like, literally, that's not for white people. Like, that's for us because we have trauma that is killing us, and it starts really early, and it takes us off the earth before we have time to become everything we're supposed to be. And I think as men, like, it's an epidemic. Like, we're sick, we're hurting, we're upset, we're tired, we're all these things, and we make up excuses as to why, as opposed to evaluating like the systems we're inside of and figuring out what does that mean to not carry that narrative forward. Like, we don't have to do certain things. It doesn't have to be that way. We talk about that in our businesses. Like, imagine a pitch deck for your emotional health, right? Like, revolutionary. This is a game changer, right? And I was like, damn, like, what if you download that for yourself?
Right.
If everything up until that point was the same, like, we should be thinking about how do you like market disrupt your insecurities? Like we use the rhetoric in everything else except who we are.
Yep.
And you're like, cool, so you're on stasis, but you're on stage talking about like hyper growth, and you've literally been the same person since you were 14.
Right.
You are literally a recessive person. You have like receded into yourself, and you wonder why the quality of your relationships are bad. Because it starts to get real, I think, in our late 20s. Because up until that point, we've been sort of socialized together, right? You did school with people, you went to undergrad together, maybe even lived together, but then people start making different choices. Fall in love, get married, have kids, leave the country, do a career pivot. And so there's this inherent tension as we sort of like evolve and discover who we are. And I think the socialization separates us. That separation isn't necessarily about like we fell out or we did all these things. Sometimes it's just about like, I have to go grow. And if you've never experienced your own growth, you will literally leapfrog into resentment. You'll be like, all right, well, we make up reasons as to why that's someone else's fault. We get mad, we hold grudges, we let it, and we project that into everything. We project that into like why someone doesn't pay attention to us, why we don't get the attention we think we deserve, you know, why this person owes us something, you know, why she should pay attention to you. And then we know what the extreme of that is because it's become the norm, right? And we cannot not have conversations about advocacy when we don't talk about what accountability would look like, because it starts with you, and then it starts with like having a conversation with your homie and be like, actually, man, like, that's not okay. Here's why that's not okay. And here's why that is actually not, don't ever do that in my presence. I'm not fucking with that. And that's something I've had to check myself on, but that's like that cuts to the heart of like where I think we know the delta is, because we all know where we want to go. But I don't know if we like are really willing to do what it would take to get there. Because it's easier, again, it's just like a company. It's so much easier to imagine what life is after the round closes. It's so much easier to be like, this is what we're going to do here. You can make the illest budget. That doesn't help with the P&L of this quarter, right? Because you're projecting into the future and neglecting the present. And a founder has to do both.
Right.
But like, as a person, I have to do both. I have to deal with my present circumstances and the reality of that and believe better for myself, but also make actions that align with what future Jonathan would look like. And I feel like we don't necessarily take time to have that conversation with ourselves. So we like ask for help when in reality we talk about how self-reliant we are. But this is an area where I think we have we haven't gotten our sea legs yet, and it requires us to like do that. Like these are conversations that like I have a lot more frequently now. They just don't happen online. But a lot of my homies this year hit me up about like therapy, getting on medication, like unlearning certain stuff, things that happened to them when they were like younger, and like how did like no rubric for processing, right? That doesn't mean you get to act out, but I do think like we don't even the compassion we demand from other people and we don't give to ourselves. It always shows out. Like there's no way to avoid seeing what it actually looks like.
Right. And there's nothing wrong with like, I hate that there's like a stigma around men and just kind of doing the work to like know themselves and figure out their worth. And it's just like, oh no, there's a lack of masculinity there. You got to toughen up, just get over it. Like just keep leaping over the hurdles. And it's like, no, that's how you get hurt. Ignoring like what's going on inside, ignoring what's happened in your past and not reaching out to people. That's how you continue to stay in these moments of yourself where you aren't getting to the next level, where you aren't able to converse with others in a proper way, in a way that serves you and everyone else in the room. And I think it's so important right now that you took the time, John, to just, speak on that, to say that not only are you doing the work, but other men that are out there, other Black men who are out there doing the work as well, and it's effective. It takes time. It can be scary. It can be annoying. It could be all those things. It could hurt again. You have to dig. Like I tell people all the time, like you have to dig and like really assess like what happened back there. Like what happened when I was 12? What happened when I was 6 that I just am ignoring? And yet it keeps showing up in my conversations. It keeps showing up in my relationships. It keeps showing up in my behavior. So I commend you for like speaking on that, because I think it's so important to have this conversation now and to continue to have it with others. And I'm almost curious too, because it's like a part in my own self-discovery and like learning of my worth, where it was like a shift. Like I was doing the work, I was digging, I was assessing, I was writing things down, journaling, kind of revisiting past things. But it was like the moment when I started practicing forgiveness that it kind of was like, whoa.
Yeah.
Like, oh shoot, now I feel like the release. Now I feel like I'm not, attached to those moments anymore.
Yeah.
Like what was your process with like forgiveness?
Yeah, it's interesting. So I think for me, right, it came down to like, I know how to fight. I'm not really good at surrendering. And so I had to like surrender has been a really, really powerful tool for me, because I think I've been doing it, but I've been fighting it. So I've been like really like, I think sometimes again, and part of this is one of those issues where like you learn it growing up. It's a dialectic, so it can be true here and also true here. So I think like perseverance is like just a like beloved like thing, right? From like an immigrant family. It is like a calling card. I think the danger with that is like when you start to love yourself, you deserve to literally let things go that don't serve you. You deserve to quit, to stop. You don't have to finish like every chapter, every story. Like you can just be like, actually, this is unhealthy for me. The problem is like I didn't have that many models of that. And so I thought there was something like morally reprehensible about stopping, assessing, and leaving. That's like a negative script that sometimes gets like, entrepreneurship doesn't help release that. Because I think sometimes you don't know, it can be tough to know when to pivot and when to like persevere through the valley and the dip. And then you're like, okay, we're back up. That was, what I mean? And that's the constant push and pull. Is this the right tactic? That's why you A/B test things. Is this right? Is it wrong? Do I have confirmation bias here? Like, is it working because I want it to work, or is it actually effective as a tool or a strategy? And for me personally, I think that was really tough, is when I was like, you know what? These things that happened to me in my past, like, just saying I got through them is not adequate. That is not an adequate descriptor of what happened. I was brutalized through them, or they really hurt me here, or like I found a way through that. But I need to acknowledge like that there were moments of like deep brokenness, and like I had unhealthy coping mechanisms that I used to do it. And so I need to tell a more holistic picture, because I'm not unworthy because that happened to me. And so to get there, to realize like this does not make me unworthy, I had to really just sort of understand surrendering to that moment was like the thing. It was like, damn, if I can like get here, like future Jonathan will happen. My brother and I had this conversation. Like, I'm a Jay fan, But I don't want to get to 47 to have those realizations.
Right.
I rather have my 444 moments right now. And I still be feeling late to myself. I'm like, damn, like what was I doing? But like, please, like that's like, I can do this work now. Like I have a chance to do this work now because literally the quality of my family's life could be irrevocably affected in a positive direction if I took care of myself and I was just able to like engage with like things that I otherwise used to run from, because that's the alternative is like you get clarity when you get it, but there's opportunity to engage in that work. The question is whether you avoid it and how frequently and how many distractions you use to not do your own work. And we work really hard. There's tons of meritable ways for me to avoid having important conversations with myself. There's tons of ways to avoid going to see a therapist.
Right.
None of that avoidance helps. And so that's the other thing. Like, I can be successful here, and I'm also successful in avoiding all the growth I could have if I loved myself enough to go do the difficult things. Because again, the parallels here are just like unmistakable. But like that's the reason you jumped to like build a company in the first place. It's like you literally thought you had a vision, and you're like, cool, I'm willing to. I don't know all the things that are gonna happen. I know it's gonna be hard. Then I discovered how hard it is, but at least I tried, and I feel like I had to take that risk on myself, which wasn't a risk. It was like love. Love just feels like a risk if you haven't felt it before.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, think about that concept of forgiveness. It's like, I think when people hear that, you immediately think of forgiving other people for some kind of indiscretion or some wrong they did against you. But oftentimes that word is used for ourselves.
Yourself, exactly.
Like forgive, like you mentioned, unworthy, feeling unworthy, right? I think about Maya Angelou. Maya Angelou was a prostitute at one point in her life. And she goes from that to, I don't need to say how successful she's been, but when you're delivering speeches to open up for presidents, that is a transformation. But through all the things, I mean, her story is so interesting to me because she never really thought of herself as less. She just figured she had to do these things to get to where she needs to be, right? Of course, many things happen where your light kind of shines brighter and you get more clarity of what you're supposed to be doing on this planet in front of you. But still to have that kind of that level of understanding of, to your point, if this is the most successful day you've ever had left, could you live with yourself beyond that? And it speaks to this idea of like, really forgiving yourself for decisions you've made at times where many times that's all the input you had and you made what you felt was the best decision. And Kelly and I talked about this in the office the other day. Somehow the concept of love came up, and I was like, there's many times where Kelly was saying that in those spaces of talking to friends about their love interests and things that have gone awry, getting them to realize what was wrong with it versus you telling them what's wrong with it, right? Because self-actualization and realizing it for yourself is way stronger in terms of changing what you're about than someone telling you it and then you being forced out of pride or whatever, having to then compartmentalize what that means and break it down, right? So in those spaces, it's like we're human, and everybody, even for as insidious as some people can be, everybody has lovable character traits that sometimes we can attach ourselves to because we're in a certain space in our life. And then we do this thing where everybody was seeing it. We didn't quite see it because we were in that space. And after the fact, you're mad because you're like, how did I ever love that person? right? You're toxic, angry. And you kind of don't get past it. And it's like, the thing is that person, sure, they did bad things. They may have cheated. They may have, just been a sucker of energy for years on you. But it's like, you also let that happen in that space for a certain amount of time, right? And then it makes you think, well, what about myself must I correct or learn from in this and grow from? And then looking at that, now I can forgive myself, because I understand that, look, there was things about that person that I loved, but also while being able to be like, because now I forgive myself now, I can grow from it, right? And so it was kind of a tangent, but it makes me, I really feel like at this point, a lot of times when we're talking about Black men, is how we started this conversation in this piece is learning to, in spaces that cause pain, in spaces that we felt like maybe we didn't do enough, or we could have done it differently, to forgive yourself so you can move forward.
Mm-hmm.
And if we have more spaces, I think, as a collective, where it's okay to cry about things, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's okay to feel things. Like I find myself talking about that a lot now. Is like, give yourself space to feel.
Mm-hmm.
That could be just sitting down and laughing sometimes. That
Right.
could be sitting down and like just talking through something. That could be sitting down and crying for hours. But by doing that, you allow your brain and your heart to kind of align, see what was causing any kind of dissension.
Right.
And once you have that clarity, you can move past it. But until you give your space that ability you give yourself the ability to have that space to do that and think through it or talk through it, you just harbor it and harbor it, and it just festers inside. And some people can see it and they go, I'm good off of that. And other people just won't ever. Other people you'll engage with, and you'll keep making the same mistakes as you point out, and you'll never know why that keeps happening in your life.
Yeah.
So no, it's all really real stuff. Yeah. Makes me think. We can say it now because you've announced it formally, but you decided recently to leave Blavity.
Yeah.
Amazing company that you've co-founded with Morgan, with Aaron,
Jeff.
Jeff.
Yeah.
Yes. What fueled that decision? And how are you feeling now about it?
Yeah, man. So I think for me, it was just time. And I think this is part of like my own process of transition has been like acknowledging. Sometimes we are forced into completely zero-sum decisions. So it's like, this is right, this is wrong. I got to do this for this. I think as I've grown up, I've felt like some of this stuff is less about zero-sum. It's about, this is a good thing, but maybe there are other things for me that are good to me and better position me for other things that I know I want. And that has nothing to do with the thing you're leaving. It has everything to do with the future you want to imagine for yourself. And that I'm the person who sort of like can intellectually download something pretty quickly. It might take me like a long time to like implement the download. So it'll like sit in the downloads folder before I like open the zip file. I'm like, all right, let me double click. Let me like extract. Let me sit here for like the blue bar to cross. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like it takes me a while to do that. And so, I felt that like there's what if. It was one of the most powerful questions that I worked with a coach over the past year and a half, and that was one of the things we talked about a lot. Was like, what does future Jonathan need? Like, what would future Jonathans look like if? And just like suspend disbelief, because I'm a fairly I'm a bit of a realist. I'm pretty contrarian, so I'm always like, if someone says this, I'm like, yeah, but what about that? And she was like, suspend that for a second and let yourself sit in the discomfort of realizing that everything you want is on the other side of a couple decisions you're struggling to make. And so I think for me, it's around like, how do I feed my curiosities? How do I connect things that seem to be like disparate? And how do I put myself in, new rooms and new spaces to really learn and like to crystallize some of these conversations, we've been having and things like that. Like, how do I build things that sort of float around in my head? Like, how do I take it from just being ideation and make it into a physical thing that I can then iterate and grow from? And, how can I imagineer something to being? And I think I had to think about what spaces those would be and, what I wanted that to look like for myself in a really specific way. And so Nieman was something I'd known about for a while, but it's like 26 of the world's, best journalists from around the globe that are just like doing all kinds of stuff and like really sitting and thinking about these deep questions about media and about the future of storytelling and news. And my belief is that media is still one of the most powerful entities on the planet because it can condition someone to believe something about themselves, and it could be completely untrue. And it could lock them into something they don't know they're locked into, or it can unlock things. And so I'm like, okay, I know how important narrative is. So, an academic year at Harvard with unfettered access to their resources feels like the right use of time.
And beyond that.
Yeah. And so I think, but that's the thing about transitions. A lot of times, again, to this success thing, I realized, and we talked about this, there were people I met over the course of 4 years. I got to see them, and I made a conscious decision that I said I would never be like that. And it like broke my heart. And a couple times, people I really, really respected, but I said, you're choosing to not disclose the kind of information that would help people make better decisions. You would rather them make the same decisions so you can appear like a savior than avoid it and risk them passing you. And that is beyond being selfish. It prohibits people's growth potential when they connect with you. The minute they like seed into you, you've already made a value judgment about them by you choosing not to do that. And I said, for me not to be that person, I have to be the same kind of person who takes bigger risks where I don't know the outcome. Mm-hmm. And I think for me, this was one where I was happy, right? Like I built a thing with 3 people I went to school with, and it's beautiful. It's helped people, but there's more for me. And so more looks different than it used to. Right. You know what I mean? I think I've gotten a lot clearer on what more is. And, I think the elements that make up a wealthy life are becoming more apparent than they were before. And so I'm grateful for that. And I think this opportunity is one for me to really sit and think about how to broaden my expertise and continue to provide more value.
Dope stuff, man. Mm-hmm. Yeah, congrats on that.
Appreciate it.
That stuff, man.
Appreciate it.
Are you available to talk about some of the risk or what you're going to do more of, especially in media, since you're so ingrained in that?
Yeah. So I think for me, it's really thinking about a couple questions. One of them has been around how we don't have enough, I think, measurement around our, cultural impact. So I think there are a lot of consumer facing data numbers, right, on women entrepreneurs and Black buying power. But I've been really concerned that that's where the granularity stops. Mm-hmm. And that's not true for any other consumer group. Right. Like the data around us never cuts between things. And if it does, it's essentially about the detrimental things that are taking place. And that is deeply important for us to understand the context. But where we are rich, where we are unmatched, where we are undisputed is in the production, creation, and furthering of global culture everywhere. Yes. But it is a disastrous and a systemic reality that that never pops up. There's no annual study of Black global footprints that is cross-listed with GDP of a country or a city like Drake. That stat about Drake driving $400 million or something to Toronto's actual GDP.
LeBron James $386 million.
So that's one thing. A lot of the crux of my research, I said to Harvard when I wrote my personal statement, was around I want to study the actual emergence of Black digital media, and what that means. Because if you take historical lens, Black media publications were coming to age during a time of Jim Crow. Mm-hmm. And so it's how are you building a publication with circulation with a population that's essentially been relegated as less than human, is emerging in a society that is still de facto slavery, still making it impossible for ownership. And the few that do have it are trying to figure out how to extend that. And that's your environment. That's your media climate. That's it. That's what you're doing. And so people like Arturo Schomburg, who literally left his artifacts in Harlem. And that's how we got the Schomburg, and essentially built his wealth creation vehicle so he could find these artifacts and keep them, and literally keep them restorative, and be look at all these other museums. People treat our art as if it doesn't matter, then put it on display for us to go see. Right. And so I think about that culturally. I don't really want to live in a world in which our things are put on display for us to go pay. And that's what happens right now. We go pay to see ourselves and never recoup any value. The other side of it was around individuals as media companies, right? So LeBron, a Drake, a Cardi B, they function as their own sort of media company, right? They've got the personhood, they've got sort of the media buying arm, they've got the attributes of them as a company, and they monetize off of that. But that has fundamentally shifted the media and advertising landscape. That has changed how global holding companies deal with media buying and culture, and how they treat certain things they used to not pay attention to. And so that's really what I'm going to spend some like deep time thinking about. I think there's probably some other stuff around protecting our IP. And I think with the emergence of things like blockchain and decentralizing, like how do we make sure that we are able to charge full dollar for what we want, and that we're also able to protect our unique creations, and making sure there's a system and a blueprint to pass that down, and to make sure that we have cultural wealth, obviously financial wealth, and social capital. And how do we keep that? How do we grow it? How do we become more powerful in that? And how do we reimagine this future that we talk about?
Yo, it's been real, man. That's a perfect way, I think, to perfect place to leave it. Thanks, brother, for coming through.
Always. Anything for y'all.
Yeah, and at home, you're obviously getting gems on just what the power we have in front of us and what we can do in terms of making sure that we have generational wealth. We're able to better and strengthen our communities. And that's not just physically, but also mentally within our own brains. So thanks again, brother. This is the Take Ownership series. As you all know, it's all about taking ownership of your mental, your economics, and your community. Thanks for rocking with us. Where can people find you, John?
Oh, man, I'm on the internet at JON 2_ Jackson. If you use 1_ you're going to hit a random white guy who literally lives in London. He's been gracious enough to, obviously send my replies back. But it's just JON 2_ Jackson. And I'll hit you back.
I typed in johnjackson.com this morning. I think I found that guy. So
the dude, he's been on Days of Our Lives for 11 years. He's got a really successful country music career. One of my life goals is to unseat him on the Google Trend results. Yeah, it's a life goal.
Hey, it's good stuff, guys. Hey, it's all love. Thanks for joining us, guys. Have a good one.